everyone. Good afternoon. I wanted to say first off, thank you to everyone for choosing to be here this afternoon and spend your time with us. As most of you, if not all of us know, today is a very, very special day because we are celebrating AAFE's 50th year anniversary. So we're going to have a lot of time tonight to celebrate together, but we actually just wanted to spend the next hour or so reflecting on and reconnecting with some of our organizational founding principles and our ideals. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Cathy Kim. I am the recently appointed board chair of AAFE, and I have the very, very distinct honor of moderating a panel of 4 trailblazing, pioneering community development leaders here today, who 50 years ago from this month gathered just about a mile east of where we're sitting here today to gather and fight for what was right and what was just when they saw that a private developer was refusing to hire locally from residents within the surrounding community, particularly from communities of color. And it was that commitment in these 4 hearts and souls and many others that became a movement, a long-lasting movement that would then be captured into what became an organization called Asian Americans for Equality. Asian Americans for Equal Employment. And it was that movement that really is at the heartbeat of what AAFE is today as an organization. And that we think is such an important thing to reflect on, especially today on this day that we're celebrating the 50th year anniversary of AAFE, to reflect on how we harness that energy as we move forward into the future. And so what better way to do that than with these 4 pioneers? Literally, that's what's written on their name tag. So it's very apt. I'm gonna actually introduce our 4 panelists very briefly before we get started. I'm gonna start with Lydia. Lydia is the current vice president of AAFE's board of directors, and she was most recently the president of AAFE's board of directors for 6 years. And before she retired, she was a senior advisor at Enterprise Community Partners. And then right next to her is Phil Thompson, who was a former deputy mayor for strategic policy initiatives under the de Blasio administration, and was also the deputy general manager for the New York City Housing Authority. And he is currently a professor of political science and urban planning at MIT. And then right next to him, we have Doris Koo, who was AAFE's first executive director, and was also the president and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, and she is currently the deputy executive director of the Seattle Housing Authority and currently chair. No?
Long time.
Oh, long time ago. Okay, but currently chair of the Pacific Hospital Preservation and Development Authority Governing Council in Seattle. And then finally, last but not least, we have Margaret Chin, who was also an AAFE board chair in the 80s, and then served as AAFE's deputy executive director. And after that, she would serve on the New York City Council for about 11 years.
12.
I believe 12 years, representing this district, correct?
How many days?
Right.
3 terms.
And as you can see, each of them have come to shape the local community economic development field here in New York City, but also nationally. And so with that, I'm gonna take a seat and join you and launch into our panel discussion. And I'm gonna take us back to 50 years ago. So let's start there at Confucius Plaza. And this is for Lydia, Phil, and Margaret to start. Can you just share with us, like, where were you, quite literally, when you first learned about what was happening at Confucius Plaza? Like, what was going on in your mind when you decided to get involved in the movement? And please don't leave out any of the juicy details, because I have been told about broken cars, arrests, babies in tow, and gathering in like some really incognito apartments in this neighborhood. So just paint the picture for us, if you will.
So 50 years ago, I was a student at City College of New York, and some of my colleagues that are around the room were students at City College with me. And we had come out of battles for an Asian American Studies program, and we had fought together with other third world students for an ethnic studies program. Part of our education and learning about our history, we became very proud of our history, not only of where our families came from and our ancestors, but our history in this country and what we had contributed to this country. And so here we have this big building being built with a lot of public dollars, the biggest you've ever seen in New York City's Chinatown, and not a single person from the community being hired. We also didn't know a lot about construction. And so we said, well, how are we going to learn how to protest and ask for jobs for the community? And I think this again speaks to some of the values of the beginnings of AAFE, is that we reached out to communities that had done this before, had been our allies. And I remember going to Harlem's Fight Back, and we met with people there, the Coalition of Black and Latino Workers, and they explained to us what you need to do to shape a job site and how you have to pick it and get jobs. And for the first time, we had to figure out how to do that in Chinatown, where people hadn't done that before. And I think part of that work was coalition building, not only with other folks in other communities that had done this before, but among other Asian Americans that supported us. And I remember when we were trying to gather people and galvanize support for this, the Benevolent Association, the traditional leaders in Chinatown, wondered, well, why do you have to reach out to other Asian Americans? Well, this is not their fight, this is Chinatown. And at the same time, they said, why do you need to bring Black and Latino people into the community? It is our fight. And we said, no, this coalition building, and this is the people who can show us the path, because they've done this before, but also they support us and they walk the picket line with us. And I think that's a lot of the origins of why we did what we did, but also I think a lot of us felt that we had not always had the best opportunities, and definitely our parents didn't. And so here's an opportunity for better paying jobs in construction than in garment or restaurants and things like that. So that was part of the reason for trying to push to open up the doors.
Margaret.
Yeah.
Margaret.
I was also at City College at that time. As an immigrant who came to this country when I was about 9.5, grew up in Chinatown. You know, father worked in the restaurant, mother worked in the garment factory. And I remember in high school, in the history class, there was one sentence: the Chinese helped build the railroad. That was it. And at the same time, you know, they were taught other, you know, history about China and the corruption with the Qing dynasty. And by the time I got to City College, I took an Asian study course by Professor Betty Lee Song called Chinese in America. And it really opened up my eyes to see that we are part of this country. We helped build this country. Our ancestors helped build this country. And I think that was a turning point for my life, because, you know, growing up in Chinatown, being an activist wasn't my kind of thing. I was more into culture, you know, dancing and acting in plays in the church, and demonstrating, never, right? But it was really with that Asian study course. And then after that, another class was called Community Practicum. And it was like Asian studies to serve the community. I remember also, you know, rallying for ethnic study, and there was demonstration, and Lydia's husband, well, I think it was your boyfriend at that time, Richard was in my class. Richard Wong was in my class. And, you know, and I don't know, somehow he convinced me to go to their rally, and I was speaking on the bullhorn. And there was a picture of it to document that I was there, and I was like speaking on a bullhorn. And I think through that struggle, and also taking other ethnic study classes, really kind of pushed me to really get more involved. At the same time, I also work in Chinatown with Minerva. She's sitting there. That time was a summer program called Asian Children's Underground. That was before AAFE got started. And so we were helping garment workers, providing daycare. A lot of us, you know, really didn't know how to take care of young kids. And the garment workers were begging us, can you take my kids for the summer? You know, they have no place to go. And we were telling them, we don't know how to change diapers. And there was 3 But because of all the Asian study class, the professors and the teachers kind of mobilized the student to go down there and participate in the demonstration to support, fighting for jobs. And when you see some of the slogan, it's like, Chinese build a railroad. Why couldn't we build a building? And we build buildings in China and Taiwan. Why couldn't Hong Kong? Why couldn't we build it here? And I think that really galvanized the community. And as Lydia was saying, it was better paying job because the only other jobs available were in the restaurant, in the laundry, in the garment factory. So these were good paying jobs. And another thing was that, they used the excuse, say, well, you don't speak English. Excuse me, there were all these construction workers that were on site, didn't speak English either. But they had a foreman who spoke Italian and English, and they were able to translate. Why couldn't? That also goes for Chinese workers. And I think when you look at the demonstration, the picture, it really represents the sentiment of the oppression that people feel. And this is an opportunity to get a better future. So you see garment workers coming during their lunchtime, senior citizen marching. People were told, you're going to get arrested. You're going to get in trouble for demonstrating. Nobody listened, and the demonstration got bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we were conscious of, that we had peers who were undocumented, who were afraid of if they were arrested, they would be subject to deportation. So we said, people who had permanent status or who were citizens don't have to worry about it. We would get arrested, and we did get arrested. And I remember we had these battles with the Benevolent Association. They said, well, we can negotiate. You don't have to go on the picket lines. You don't have to get arrested. And we said, well, people don't listen and don't hear you unless you do that. And I think for the first time, the community stood up and did something different. And I think that's when we got the attention, is when the press came, because the demonstrations got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think we had hit a nerve in the community, because the garment shops would give people time off during lunch, and they would come out and join the picket lines. And you saw that people supported what we were trying to strive for. And I think at the time, it was unusual to see Asian Americans getting arrested, speaking up, and the press for the first time picked up and covered this stuff. And I think that made a difference in terms of bringing attention to these issues and to the community.
Well, for me, I was 18. I was younger than the others.
Yeah, we're seniors.
Not that much.
And I met some of the folks here at anti-apartheid demonstrations. And the solidarity, the interracial solidarity, was really important for all of us. And it really made the anti-apartheid movement much stronger. And one of the people I met through anti-apartheid work was a guy named Ben Tai, and I actually moved in with him in Chinatown in Boston while I was a student, and discovered Cantonese food, which was life-changing. But I, through these networks, came to New York and went to see Jim Houghton at Fight Back in Harlem, and learned what they were doing about sitting in at job sites to demand jobs for the community, which we did. And here in Confucius Plaza, and I remember Local 2 brought guns. Some of the workers brought guns, and we stood firm. And then someone, might have been Richard, said, we gotta go talk to the Tongs. And I was like, what? And they were like, we gotta go meet with the Tongs. They wanna know what we're doing. And I was like, what's a Tong? So we went to this place and met with, I still don't know who they were. We met with these folks, and they said, what are you doing in the community? And we explained, we're trying to get jobs for the community. We're trying to fight against police brutality in Chinatown or whatever. And they were like, great, good, go for it. And I guess that was a blessing or something at the time. But it was I think one of the things that I came out of it is that if we work together, we're just so much stronger than if we try and fight battles separately. And that was also the spirit, I think, of Jim Houghton and others. They were excited to see, like, more people were picking up on these strategies.
Thanks, Phil. I want to bring Doris into this conversation, and this is for Doris and Lydia. And some of you have already touched on this, but, you know, one's decision to get involved in a movement like this and to stay involved and to build a career around it is often deeply personal. It's personal. Can you tell us a little bit about what were your either personal life events or what was happening in the world at that time that impacted your sense of community and belonging in those movements? And what moved you, right, to get involved and commit your career to this kind of work?
Thank you, Cathy. It feels like we should be in comfy chairs, sort of fireside chat, reminiscing about how you got involved, where were you, and all of that stuff. Not so formal sitting behind this table, but I kept waving to old friends. I came from a very different place than all of them. I wasn't born here. I wasn't an immigrant. I wasn't an immigrant at 9 years old that my parents brought over. I came as an 18-year-old, as a global citizen, student to study at the University of Wisconsin. And I grew up in Hong Kong and remembered very clearly I refused to sing God Save the Queen, refused to drink tea with milk and sugar, all of that stuff, just because there's some inkling within myself that we governed by somebody sent over from UK to Hong Kong who don't look like us, who don't talk like us, but made us instead learn a different language to operate. Well, anyway, my parents wanted me to study computer science in Wisconsin, and unfortunately, the timing was totally wrong. It was 1969, 1970 when I was a freshman, and it was the heat of the anti-war movement. Not just in Wisconsin, sparked again by Columbia University, just like the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza. But I was wrapped up with the passion and the sentiment and the focus of American students who knew very little about the world other than that its country is waging war in Vietnam on a foreign country for no reason at all. And it made no sense to the students. And again, like Richard did to Margaret, I was dragged out of the dorm of the computer lab and say, Doris, you came from Asia, you gotta march with us. We gotta have people speak up for themselves. So from one thing, it was another. After the war, it was women's movement, it was Wounded Knee, 4 students died in Kent State. All of you lived through that period. I changed. I was no longer a computer science major. Who wants to talk to machines at that time? I switched to sociology, and my professor said, you want reality? You leave Madison, Wisconsin, and you go to Chicago. Now, we don't have tongs in Chicago, but we have gangs on the south side of Chicago. Being alone with no family here, I very quickly gravitated around the Chinatown in Chicago. Taught English there, met my husband there. He was coaching basketball at the youth center, and I was teaching English. What opened my eyes even more was I was in graduate school by then in 1974. And I took classes from a professor who was an ex-Black Panther. And he had us read Malcolm X, Martin Luther King writings, Chairman Mao, collected works, Karl Marx, Lenin, the whole thing, and force a global perspective on and shine the spotlight on the local struggle of class division, income division, racism, and all the theoretical stuff that was difficult to comprehend but made a lot of sense at that time. And then I read about Confucius Plaza, 1974. It was like, whoa, what is going on in New York City? And I think around that same time, there was an international hotel struggle in San Francisco as well. Yeah. Folks were doing a sit-in at the I Hotel, just like folks in New York were doing marches and demonstrations around Confucius Plaza. And I was wondering why I was in graduate school. So very quickly after that, I graduated and worked in the South Side of Chicago, where it was very clear. There was an invisible wall dividing the university and the South Side community, where our ex-president Barack Obama lived. And he became a community organizer 10 years after I became a community organizer. Anyway, it was an experience that told us, because Chinatown was so small, we couldn't get anything done unless we built coalitions. I was organizing parents to fight for bilingual education, and we couldn't make it unless the Mexican parents who live in Pilsen also joined up and went to the school together and held back their children from classes together. And very early on, realized the importance of coalition building. And needless to say, when I finally moved to New York, because my husband's grandmother was a garment worker in New York, that was the first family I got in the United States since I came. And the rest is history. You know, when you see Margaret, when you see Lydia, when you see Phil, when you see Ronnie Chin, when you see everyone passionate, throwing money out of their pocket to pay rent at 1 East Broadway, at 98 East Broadway, being evicted by landlord because they were demonstrating for something that the landlords realized at some point was against their economic interest. Why did I make it into a career? I really didn't, Cathy. But I had a family, a young family at that time when I moved here, and we have a mortgage to pay, and I couldn't work a full-time job and do weekend stuff and do evening stuff. It's tiring. So I remember telling Bill Chong and Margaret and folks at AAFE, if we can just raise some funding, I'll quit my job and I'll work here as the executive director. Then there was a big debate. If you get funding, you're going to sell out your principles. You got to compromise your values because your funders will require that you do something different. And I remember saying, then we'll turn the funding back. But right now, this is not sustainable. I can't work 24/7 being a young mother. And the decision was made. I quit my job, took a big salary dip, and became the first ED of AAFE. And there was no looking back. It was what made me who I am. No one would hire me if I were to apply for any executive director position. And here I was handed the perfect job to build something for which I would voluntarily work for free to build up, other than the life circumstances. So, you know, I don't want to glorify how I got involved and how self-sacrificing it was. It was driven a little bit by necessity, but then balancing life and work, balancing what you believe in. And the key issue I want to leave to today's young people is that you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. You can work at Wall Street. I worked at the CUNY system. I had a pension, I had everything. I broke loose. I worked for $30,000 with no pension, no health benefit, and eventually became the president and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners because they saw in us, in the people that sit at this table, in you, a passion that is not just looking at something you do as a job. It is a passion that you bring with you, that drive you, that motivate you, that will make you solve problems in spite of the hardships. So, you know, the fireside chat is that we elders now, we kind of put lessons out there, but I need to stop soon.
Lydia?
So I think of the early days of community development, at the time it wasn't an industry. It was sort of like an outgrowth of organizing. And you said you can only do so much advocacy if you can't produce any results. So you need to get jobs, but you also need to do more than just fight for rights. And I think Chinatown was going through fires. It was going through a lot of disinvestment. And so I think we looked at what can we do, and there were other organizations like us across the country that started to look at what can we do in our own community, because we couldn't wait for someone to come in because they were not coming. No one was coming to help you. We had to kind of lift ourselves up. And I think that's how we got into what was now community development. At the time, it was like, we need to save this building. We need to get tenants heat and hot water. People didn't think of it as community development at the time. It was more about just getting rights for people who, you're paying rent, you should have a decent place to live. And at the time, I remember when we were looking at the first project, we said, well, how long can people stay in shelters? They need a place to live, a permanent place to live. And so we said, why couldn't we just also learn to do housing itself? And I think at the time, it wasn't as siloed or sophisticated an industry as it is today. So we didn't know what the heck we were doing. We went in there, applied for money, got things, and we got funded. Today, you would not be able to do the same thing. I think people have degrees now, and they do this work from the ground up, and everything is very siloed. But at the time, I think a lot of people who got into housing actually did it from the organizing perspective, and that's how we grew. And I think even the same thing with trying to support small businesses was with the idea of how do you get resources and capital to local businesses so they can thrive, because a lot of our communities were suffering from not being able to get foot traffic in or being able to support themselves. So I think a lot of what we know as an industry today at the time was developed through organizing and trying to bring resources and support to the community so they could be thriving communities. And we've been so successful now that they've become gentrified, and so now our job is a little bit different. It's like, how do we preserve these cultural and social and economic engines so they can be places for everybody who wants to continue to live there and not be displaced or priced out of these communities. But I think a lot of the work that is now community development came out of a lot of the organizing, not just in New York, but across the country. And you have organizations like ours now that are also celebrating 50 years or 40 years and getting to the same place. But I think a lot of it came through the guts of trying to bring something different to the communities that we cared about and that we came from, that our parents really treasured and wanted to be part of and stay part of, and felt that it gave them something they wouldn't have otherwise. And I would say that it's no less important today, and it can be a career, whereas at the time it wasn't a career. It was a way to sacrifice and say, because you believed in it, that you would get less pay. You may not get benefits, you don't get vacation, but it's rewarding kind of work. And now I think it's amazing how much of an industry it has become, and a career that people can choose to kind of devote themselves to.
I have one more personal question for you all before we go back into the sort of macro. I mean, you guys, obviously, all of you got involved at a relatively younger age, right? And I'm not sure if this is something that you and your friends were just talking about, and that this is what was just done with teenagers when you guys were growing up, but or if not, like what were your friends thinking, and what did your family think about your involvement in all of this work? I mean, clearly you were really busy thinking about the well-being of society at large, but what was your family thinking in all of this? And again, your friends, if they weren't getting involved with you. I'm just curious.
Well, I think we made new friends. You know, I mean, that,
Yeah, but each other.
and we lost some old ones, but I think at that time was really, you talked about earlier, it's the passion. I mean, it's like you finally have something that you believe in, and you figure it's worth it, because I think that all the years of oppression and not being recognized as American, as our contribution to this country, that all the students who've taken an Asian study course or other students that have taken ethnic study really learn about the history. And you really wanted to like fight and like really like make a strong statement that we're not invisible. And so like all the demonstration, I mean, even in Confucius Plaza, it didn't end there. I mean, even we got some job the first time around. They built another building on Mott Street, you know, a big commercial building. We did the same thing. We demonstrated, we shaped, you know, we wore the hard hat, got cursed at by construction workers. They still weren't hiring people of color construction workers. It's a long struggle. But the interesting thing is that, you know, as the passion grew and get more support from the community, because like AAFE has always taken the lead. You know, we have always done things that other people don't do. Because like when there were fires in the community, we go and organize. I remember one case, I had a full-time job. I work in the school system. 3 o'clock, I come and volunteer. And Yiling and KW is not here, but they're also one of the pioneers. And at AAFE, we found out about this eviction that a landlord was doing, just like tearing down apartments, evicting people. And the last tenant came up to AAFE. All he wanted was a translation on a piece of paper that said, hand over the key by this date and you get $5,000. And I'm there, like, I'm looking at this piece of paper. There's no letterhead. It's not notarized. There's no guarantee. And I explained to the tenant, and it happened to be KW's uncle that I found out. And I was like, that we could still organize and fight. And he said, he called me by my Chinese name, Chen Ziman. I'm the last tenant there. Everybody was driven out. And you know, with us, AAFE, we never just give up. We went and organized all the tenants back, even the one that moved to LA. Right? And that was a special zoning called Special Manhattan Bridge District that the city passed without involving the community. I mean, you're talking about land use zoning, right? And this was like in the 80s. And it's just like unbelievable what we went through. And I was pregnant at that time. And we went to the community board and they said, I said, you guys passed this. Did you know a whole building of people were evicted? They didn't even know that. And the leadership in Chinatown were at a meeting that the housing committee voted for it, and they didn't even know that this was happening. And we went through all the Chinese newspaper and there was no notice. Ultimately, there was a lawsuit against the city for lack of bilingual notice. We won on the Supreme Court, but then we lost on appeal. But that really started us in terms of fighting and organizing tenants. And when Lydia was talking about all the fire that was happening, our thinking was like, you know, tenants has to move out, they had to go, you know, to another borough for housing, and they have to leave the community. They still work in the community, the kids still go to work, go to school. So we decided we should do some transitional housing, you know, to help these homeless families. It was a great idea. And I think we did get some funding from the Department of Social Service, New York State. We got a big check for like, what, $2 million? But the city was not supportive of transitional homeless shelter. That's less than 100 units. That was under Mayor Koch. So the first project, Equality House, right? We had to change that idea from a shelter, transitional shelter, into low-income housing. But AAFE still stuck to its principle. And there were, I think, 18 SRO units that was created in this building. And that building was a burned down building. It had just had an empty shell. And one of our old-timer, Daigu, we call her Daigu, she lived right near there. And every morning she would go and see if that building was still up, if the shell was still there, so that we can develop the project. And then Enterprise came in and you could talk about that, and took us on as the first tax credit program in New York. And that's how the housing development started.
That's great.
And how they ended up being an enterprise.
Thank you, Margaret.
But Cathy, I want to say Margaret's parents, her mother was so proud of her.
Oh.
Every time I saw her, she would beam, grin, ear to ear in terms of what her daughter's doing. But then a bit worried that she was like 8 months pregnant and still running to judges.
It was like, why do you have to
judges
stick your
decide.
neck out? That's
Yeah.
what my mother always said. But then on the other end, she's always referring cases. You know, somebody needs help, you could help, you should do it. I said, Mom, you're criticizing me for sticking my neck out and getting into trouble. And meanwhile, you give
But I would say Margaret is so right. We made new friends.
Yeah.
All the old friends that I had in high school, they had a very different lifestyle, different vibe, different preferences and stuff. And here I met hard-hitting activists who I can call comrades. Howard Chin is here. He designed Equality House. He was the creative mind that when the building caught fire because, you know, there were unsheltered people living there. You know, these were abandoned buildings, and the city wanted to tear it down. And I said, Howard, if we lose the building, the tax credits don't work because they only work for rehabilitation, not for new construction. So Howard said, if we put a beam here, a beam there, and shore it up there, the 4 walls will stand, and it's still a building. And that was how we saved the building. And Howard became a lifetime friend. I never knew Howard. He was from Philadelphia or something. And then I met Phil, and I met Lydia and Ronnie, who incorporated AAFE, and somehow your paths all merged. And then, you know, my parents from Hong Kong were not pleased at all for me dropping computer science, but Ed's grandmother, my husband's grandmother, had a different perspective. She too, like Margaret's mother, was giving us water and soups and home-cooked meals when AAFE was being evicted and people barricaded themselves and refused to move. Shirley lowered the bucket and people dropped bao and food and she pulled the bucket up.
No, she was upstairs.
Yeah, because she wouldn't go home. They were barricading it. So folks came together and we became a new family, new community, lifelong friends. And I wouldn't trade these friends for anybody.
I just wanted to say that when I moved to New York, I moved into a studio apartment with Margaret and Alan, who were newlyweds. And Alan just put like a curtain to separate off. And it was not cool. But that's how incredible, you know, they were. And, you know, when someone does that, they're your, you know, you don't forget that, you know. My mom was actually really happy. I thought I was doing something brand new, you know, this activism. And then I learned that my father and a guy named Leon Sullivan, Philadelphia, sued the building trades in 1962 for not hiring folks, community folks, not putting them on the job. And that lawsuit hasn't been settled to this day. Then my mother took me to meet Wyatt T. Walker, who was a pastor in Harlem, who was a friend of my father's, who was head of organizing for SCLC. Oh. And, you know, eventually I joined their board of Harlem HCCU, Harlem Community, HCCI, Harlem Community Congregations Incorporated, because Reverend Walker recruited me. But he had done all this organizing, and so we were actually standing on shoulders of people who went before us, and even in my own dad, and I didn't even know it. And I just came to appreciate more, like it's like a river, and we're just, you know, continuing this struggle. And my mom loved it. My mom loved it, loved the activism, loved the fact of seeing all these young people getting out there trying to make a difference.
So let's move from making friends to back to coalition building, which I think is something that each of you have talked about. And you I think Doris, you said that none of this work could happen without coalition building. So, I mean, for all of you, really, but I mean, maybe for Margaret and Phil to start from, so you were both in government, right? One of you was a government official, one was an elected. I mean, I guess from that lens, what do you think were some of the conditions that enabled that cross-racial and even intergenerational coalition building in the 70s? And what do you think might have changed, or what are some of the changes you're seeing today that present challenges or even opportunities for that coalition building?
I'll start. I would just say that I think one of the things that's happened to the housing movement, it was a movement in the beginning, and people did organizing, and it's quote unquote professionalized and got really into like packaging deals with 10 different financing sources and this reg, that reg, and all. And then folks stopped organizing. And I think what we've seen is that the affordable housing crisis is actually worse now than when we started. Right. Despite all this technical expertise we have, public policy has moved in the other direction. And so I think we need to not forget what we've learned, but we need to, in terms of how to do things, but we got to organize people if we want to make change. And in government, one of the things I tried to train my staff to do was organize. If you want to get the mayor to do something, don't follow him around all day. Organize people, and he'll come to you and ask if he can come to your meetings. And that actually is what happened, you know, with de Blasio. And I think it's true, you know, with electeds generally. But.
Yep. I mean, it's not an easy job being elected, especially the district that I represented. But it's just so important to work together with many different groups, because that's what we get our strength from. On the council, I was part of to help build up the Black, Latino, Asian caucus, the Progressive Caucus, the Women's Caucus. And it's really by, you know, working together and supporting each other's project that we were able to get a lot of things done. And you always have to sort of like organize the base of support for whatever project that you're doing. And of course, there's always going to be a naysayer out there, people who don't want any change, and you just got to stand firm and believe what you're doing is right. And ultimately, I mean, even now, the community, I think just within Chinatown, it's just too splintered, you know? And the good thing, yes, we have a lot more young people coming back, but the problem is they did not know the history, did not learn about the history. And they think that they know it all. I say, no, you gotta go back and learn the history of the struggle, how we got here. And so that's why it's really, the coalition building part is so critical. I mean, even on the whole political representation, you can't just fight for Asian. I mean, when we fought, you know, when New York City voted for a new charter and increased the size of the city council from 35 to 51, we had to work in a coalition because we want to create opportunity for Asian, but we also have to support the other group. At the same time, you know, the Latino community, they want representation in Lower Manhattan. The gay community wants representation. And so we have to really collaborate and work together. And we were able to mobilize the constituents in Chinatown, even the traditional, you know, the CCBA and some of the family association to come and testify, right? Doris was famous for the Plan A. Really like combine different neighborhoods. So it's not just, you know, one ethnicity, but really a multiracial. And then you have other people who just say, oh, there should be a minority district so we could fight against each other. No, you know, we wanted to create opportunity. And that's what AAFE was all about. I mean, it took us a long time to get the representation here, but we were able to do it in Queens. And now there are a lot more Asian on the city council, on the state assembly, state senate, even in Congress. So we help pave the way.
Can I tell you a quick story about that? I was David Dinkins' apportionment person during the redistricting that went from 29 to 51. And
35 to
was it 35?
35
35 to
51.
50. So Peter Vallone was head of the city council at that time. So I went to Peter and I said, Peter, like the city's kind of half white, half people of color. Why don't you take all the white people? And I'll take all the people of color. And he said, good idea. And we shook hands. and literally that's what happened. Like anything having to do with minorities, he would defer. And anything having to do with white folks, I would defer. And literally that's how we did it. And so we actually took Steve DeBrienza's district away from him in Sunset Park. We did a lot of reconfiguring, but the idea was we wanted to, on our side, we wanted to create more opportunities for people of color to go into the city council, but also understanding that we're doing this together, like we're helping each other.
That was the majority coalition.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
That really brought
It's called the
everyone
majority
together.
coalition.
Yeah, that brought everyone together.
Yeah.
And we did increase the number of people of color dramatically.
Yeah.
I mean, we still didn't get an Asian at that time, but I think for African American, it was increased from
Oh, God, I don't know.
6 to 12.
Something like that.
Latino was 3 to 9.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we still had 0 Asians, so we still had a long way to go.
Great. Okay, I think we're running out of time, but I do have one more question for everyone, and not everyone has to take this, but here we are, 50 years later. I refer to your lives as careers, but really this is about passion, right? I mean, how do we retain that passion, right? How do movements like the ones that you were all a part of, right? Phil, you said it. You said the affordable housing industry, it wasn't an industry, it was a movement, right? How do we retain those principles, those founding principles, as the world evolves around us? Like, how do we stay true to those core values? What advice do you have for us?
So I would say the fundamental things that we fought for have not been fixed. There is still a lot of social economic inequality. That has not gone away. And I think with the Black Lives Movement and all the recent movements you see, people are still battling the same battles. They're just as extreme. And even though they say the economy is doing well, poor people are still, there are more poor people and there are more poor children than ever before. And there's less opportunity to have housing that you can afford and a decent place to live. So those things have not changed. And until those things change, we're gonna need movements of people who organize to really uplift that, but also demand some change. And I think we're seeing young people do it, but hopefully they'll learn from what was done in the past and build on what was in the past so we're not starting all over again. But I think what they had that we didn't have was they had Wi-Fi, they had social media. We did not have that. And so we relied on printing up leaflets and things like that and bullhorns. But today you can amass people so quickly through social networks. And so I think a lot of the things that drove us to do what we did has not changed. And I think it's not just in this city, in this country, but it's internationally. You kind of look at what's happening around the world. And that's why students are still protesting. And I really felt great to see all the students protesting, not only in this country, but across the world, for fighting the same injustice that we saw. And I think it's an international thing. And I think people are feeling it. And so while things may, quote, seem improved, but they're really not, I think a lot of those things have not gone away. And until they get addressed or people really are empowered to control resources, I can't imagine people not having passion for this stuff.
Well, if you look across America, almost every major city, virtually every major city, and virtually every mid-sized city is majority Black, Latino, and Asian. And that trend is only going to increase. And so for the Trumps of the world, the only way they win is if they can divide Blacks, Latinos, and Asians. And then there's a core of urban white voters, particularly young urban white voters, who voted 80% for Obama twice. I call them a new ethnic group, who live in cities. And so that coalition is what elected Obama. That coalition is what is needed to defeat Trump. And right now, for young folks, if we are either going to take a big step forward as a nation, or we're going to take a big step backward as a nation. And so I would say we used to discuss the international situation, the national situation, and then talk about what's happening locally. That's a good thing to do, because we're on the danger of 3 wars globally. We have Trump, who's a fascist, on our doorstep, and we either organize and come together to chart a new path, or we're going back into some really dark, dark things.
And to piggyback on that, it's really crucial to have leadership. AAFE was leadership when everyone was just propelled by sentiments and emotion to fight one battle and then to recede, to wait for the next attack to come, and then to fight again. AAFE pulled everyone together and built an infrastructure. And the infrastructure exists at AAFE and among many other communities of color today. But we have to really remember that infrastructure, I would not call it bureaucracy, I would call it infrastructure, and institutions have a tendency to preserve itself. And you cannot let yourself be guided by that self-preservation tendency. Funding means a lot to AAFE now. The question to AAFE's leaders would be, when push comes to shove, and there's a principle and a policy that you really don't believe in fact, goes against the very core of your principles, are you willing to shake it up and speak out at the risk of the funder pulling away? And we have seen donors pulling away from universities over the last Gaza trouble. And it is that pivotal moment, that inflection point, where we say, where's the leadership? Where is the passion to do the right thing? And keep building coalitions. Now, Phil is right. Every major city will, by numbers, be communities of color. But just because we share the color doesn't mean we share the economic interests, right? There's vertical coalitions that you can build when there's anti-Asian hate, and you have Microsoft techies coming out just because it's too risky for them. You know, it's like driving while black. They're realizing that walking while Asian is endangering your life. Just, you know, as long as people don't know that you belong to Microsoft or Google, they will bop you on the head anyhow just because you look foreign to them. So there are these coalitions where the sentiment will force them into a movement to unite against Asian hate. But then when it's a horizontal coalition to fight for minimum wages, for gig workers, for delivery, door dashes and stuff, you would see the higher income bracket pulling away. And that's when you force a coalition then among people of color that are feeling the same economic pain. And it becomes a struggle of the class as opposed to the race. So, you know, it's complex, but it's understandable. And for leadership, strategy is to see the opportunity in the moment and build the broadest coalition you can lead to fight against that particular attack, and then try to build from there and grow the movement from there, and not let it dissipate one movement and then it pulls back and then another attack has to come, right? So for the longest time, the gay community fought AIDS alone. For the longest time, and still now, the Asian community fight Asian hate alone. Well, you see what Phil already told us, Trump is at our doorstep. He can mobilize people who felt that their self-interest as white, uneducated, lower income whites, rural, gets threatened. And they band together to fight all communities of color. So the world is way more complex today than it was, I think, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And it takes a lot more sophistication, which young people have through social media to mobilize movements and stuff. But as you see other movements in Europe or others, the youth movement gathers and then fizzles. And until you get leadership positions, so elected positions are important, organized positions are important, and the heads of AAFE and the heads of Asian American Federation, the heads of Latino coalitions must work together to preserve and grow your coalitions in order to lead the future of tomorrow, right? So I will say hope, we're very hopeful, and there's climate change that young people are very passionate about. So tap into that passion, tap into that passion. I know time's short, but I do want to tell a story of not forgetting your core and your passion. Everyone remembers Katrina, the hurricane that leveled New Orleans. I was with Enterprise Community Partners at that time, and because my area involves Texas, I went down on location to see the displaced people from New Orleans seeking shelter in Dallas, in Austin, in San Antonio, just because they couldn't go. They were displaced. And you know, my instinct was, let's get government to put some money and build some housing for you. And they said, no, we want to go home. We're not staying in Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, no way. We're going back to the 9th Ward. And if you want to help us, get us back home. So then I went to Enterprise and I said, we have a quandary. We have no presence in the Gulf Coast. We never had. Another intermediary list just left, just because the politics tend to be corrupt and people went to jail and all of that stuff. So there was a big debate within Enterprise itself that we may not be able to do anything, even though we knew what the people want and we heard them loud and clear. And I remember building a coalition on the ground with the Catholic Church, with the Vietnamese community in East New Orleans, with the Black community in the South Ward, 9th Ward. And they were eager, they were ready, they were scrubbing mold with their bare hands. They just need leadership to come in and bring some capital and wherewithal to help them. And that's the leadership void, which I brought to my CEO at that point. And I said, we Enterprise pride ourselves in delivering affordable housing, financing, and all of that. If you see the situation in New Orleans, you hurt the people, and you decided not to participate, then you don't deserve to exist. You don't deserve your reputation. And I knew I would either be fired or I might have to quit. But that changed the entire board, and it changed the CEO, because they reached down to their core and remember when they were 20 years old, what they aspired to do. And they said, Doris, if you can build a coalition, people welcome us in and not treat us as outsiders, we're going in. And we went in and delivered $200 million in investment to rebuild the East New Orleans housing, 9th Ward, and use every vacant convent parking lot the Catholic Church had to offer up and put up affordable housing there. So that story is that not only do you need to listen to the people and their desires, as opposed to saying, you're in Houston, it's much better than New Orleans, stay here, we build housing. You respect that. And then you reach back down to say, do I believe that we can help? And if you can, you must. And then the rest will come.
And she wasn't let go. In fact, she was promoted to become president and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners. So I think we are now entering the Q&A session, and so we open it up to the audience.
Oh, he,
Why do I have to stand here?
so we can see you.
Oh, okay. Hi. Glad to see you, Lydia.
Hello.
It's been 50 some odd years now. Anyway, for those of us who can claim to be in the OG group, there are many young people out there. I meet them fairly frequently, and we tell them stories of the things that we did when we were young. And they want to know how to get into and where do they go to get involved, and how do they pay off their student loans? How do they complete their degrees? And how do they bring their talents of the 21st century into the struggles that we were involved in?
Margaret.
I've seen, like, during the pandemic, a lot of young people came back to the community to help. And at that time, my office helped get a food pantry started in the Lower East Side. And people just came. And they spent their time, and they wanted to help. And I think for a lot of young people, there's lots of opportunity to volunteer. And that's how we started. So I think it's just really for them to take that step, that they want to make change, get involved.
We're only 3 years away from Black Lives Matter, and that was 23 million people who demonstrated, the largest wave of demonstrations in history. And right now, like my students at MIT and my wife's a dean at Tufts, and like everyone I know who's on a college campus, students are mobilizing around the war in Gaza, and it's become a very widespread movement. And right in front of MIT, the local high school students came and laid across the highway and stopped traffic, high school students. So I think young people are getting involved. I think the question now is like leadership and direction, and that's where some of us, you know, who've been through cycles of protest and organizing and trying different things, we can be helpful. You know, these folks want to see a better world, you know, as young people often do. And I think we can encourage them.
Time to do the health fair. You know, and it's seasonal. And some of us were fortunate enough to find plausible careers in embodying that activism. But it's tough when, in the current economy, if you have aspirations to develop the kinds of professional skills, whether it be in law, whether it be in medicine, or in urban planning, how do we get from the classroom to the streets? And how do we sustain ourselves in that process? That's what I hear. Those are some of the same questions I was raising 50 years ago.
So I think there are a lot more internships now than when we were in college. And I think a lot of the colleges do have community engagement programs where people can go in. And I know at AAFE, a lot of the staff and board members were former interns at AAFE. So I think there are career paths more so now than when we were in school, that they may not pay what Wall Street pays, but it pays a whole lot more than what Doris was getting, the $30,000. So I think there is a decent living that people can make, and also I'm seeing that young people are interested in this stuff. I've been interviewed by people, and other people are writing papers and putting stories together and movies. So I think there's a lot of interest in young people, not only in terms of what's currently protests, but also what happened in the past. I think the thing is there are avenues, and maybe we need to do a better job advertising the internships that are there, but also that there are career paths in the work that they care about. It may not, and also after we have a lot of vacancies. We have an inability to retain people in the field. And it's not that we're paying chump change. It's that there is such a competition with the for-profit sector for the same skill sets that they've learned in the community. So I think there are career paths, and more so than there ever were. So I think if people have an interest, there's a way to get in the door more so than before. And maybe if there are things that we could be doing better to kind of introduce people to what we have available, and others like us, there are a lot of nonprofits who are doing similar kinds of work, have similar needs. And I think there are opportunities in government as well.
I don't know if this is on. Thank you. It's inspiring to hear all of you chat and discuss your history and the remarkable work you've done over the past 50 years. And John, if I may, I'm not young, but I hope you have a little faith in us. I was wondering, Lydia, you talked about how when you guys began in this space, how it was not paid and how there's more opportunities now for younger folks to join. I'm always a little skeptical when things become capitalized. Do you foresee any friction there when there are job opportunities and money becomes kind of a, I don't know how to, but it's a way to tease people into the industry versus being led by passion and making those really difficult choices to leave an industry for $30,000?
I think there are those temptations and also people's demands, personal situations. You may have need to be able to support a family, a bigger family, or your parents or your grandparents, so you need to be driven to be able to. But I think there are purpose-driven jobs that pay well as well in this field, so more so than there ever was. And I've seen people who've kind of made their money come back in and either volunteer, be on a board, or take less money. We have people who've kind of matured and they said, you know, I'm ready for my second career path. And so they work in the nonprofits and they come back into the community. So I think it's not like you burn your bridges and they never come back. But I think if there is a passion for this work, I think it's not as gritty as it used to be. But I think there are a lot of opportunities. And I think we need new blood. I think we need people coming in with new ideas and new ways to think about things and new ways to organize, because how young people communicate with each other isn't the same way we communicated with each other at that time. And so things have changed in terms of how people kind of talk to each other or even engage with each other. And I think we need all of that to really be able to build the groundswell that we need to make that change. Because in the 60s and 70s, there was so much idealism. And I felt the same idealism during Black Lives Matter, and it kind of fizzled because it couldn't be maintained. And I think there is that same purpose and need exists today, never more than before. So how do we kind of get people to kind of continue that movement and support with each other? I think it's critically important. And that's why AAFE has to continue to do coalition building, that we're not in a island by ourselves, that we're working with others. Same thing with all other communities. I think it's going to take that to keep it going, but there is so much that needs to be done, and there's so much that young people can contribute that some of us just don't have the energy for it anymore.
I think with Biden, one of the fruits of electing Biden is the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Bill and Chips and Science, which is over $2.5 trillion. And so for the last 2 years, I've been working with a colleague to train graduate students and put them in cities and apply for money. And a lot of folks don't, including mayor's offices, don't know even how to apply for the money. And so we got $6 million for Honolulu State Sustainability Office, which had one person. We got $28 million for Newark, Patterson, and Atlantic City from the recent Solar for All. Unemployed Workers United joined with the county, Harris County, which is Houston, and got $250 million 3 weeks ago. Climate United, which is a coalition of a housing group, Community Preservation Corp, Calvert, Self-Help, which is a network of black credit unions in the South, got $6.93 billion 3 weeks ago, et cetera. And so the money is there, but deploying the money is going to be really hard because these credit unions don't have the staff to actually make loans, and it's supposed to be green loans. And so there's a huge number of opportunities for folks to actually who want to do movement stuff in the green space and affordable housing to take advantage of this moment. And we fought for that money. This wasn't Biden's idea. We fought for that. But now that it's coming out, it's that gap that we faced in the past where we had to learn the ropes. Like, how do you actually work with these government programs and get the money? But it's there. And historically, it hasn't been there.
I think we have time for like maybe 2 more questions.
First of all, thank you guys for taking the time to share your experience, your wisdom, your insights. I want to ask a question based on something that you touched upon at the end of the last question about, I guess, like the Black Lives Matter moving that momentum. Of course, as you all know, community development is not work that is instantly gratifying. It's work that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of commitment, takes a lot of resiliency. I'm wondering if you all can share a little bit of insights from your experience on what kept you all motivated and some tips of wisdom and advice for my generation and the generation that comes after me that's a little bit more used to getting things like this.
I want to not talk about my experience anymore, but I want to talk about my experience helping a young Black person who did exactly what you suggested in terms of building the capacity and resiliency. So after I retired and moved back to Seattle, I did a stint funded by the Seattle Foundation to build a collaborative of community activists in Seattle, which, as in Philadelphia and other people, Chinatown is right next to the Black community, right next to the another immigrant community, and so on and so forth. So we had a lot of passion fighting displacement and gentrification because of the Amazon and the Microsoft and the Google just buying up land and just pushing everyone out. So the historic Black community in the Central District is now, you know, just like the Chinatown International District, Little Saigon, and the gay and lesbian community of Capitol Hill are crunched in from all sides because of high and hyper hot real estate value. And there were organizations in Chinatown, in the gay community, and in Little Saigon, but not in the Black community because of the deep oppression that they sensed after the Black Panthers had a big presence there in Seattle's Black community. But because of the redlining and because of the oppression and the killing off of the planters, the Black community moved away. And there was this father and son who fought sort of like lone wolves until the Black Lives Movement, when they gelled together sentiments. And they were shutting down every community meeting. They were loud. They brought people to shout down the politicians and stuff. But it was like they lost people after people because they were just fighting one way and one way only. They were willing to get busted. They've gone to jail a few times. And yet their tactics didn't change. And so because of the coalition work that I took on, I went to White King, Garrett is his name, and I said, White King, what is your purpose in your fights? And he said, oh, you know, anti-racism, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I said, how do you galvanize people to build around you as opposed to just, you know, feeling that you're fighting our battle, but it's not a battle that I can join? And he said, I don't know, you know, my father got busted, I'll get busted, my sons will get busted, that's our tradition, we're gonna take that stand. Long story short, there was this big development that used to be the gathering place of the Central District, and it was being sold. It was owned by old-time white people, rented to the Black community for gathering halls and stuff, and now sold to be developed into condominiums. And I said, this is your chance to fight, not against some abstract notion, but you want to fight for land. You want land to rebuild back the community. So they built this community organization then called Africa Town Community Land Trust, because they did believe that without land to stake your rebirth, they would just be pushed out, you know. And so I helped the Africa Community Land Trust negotiate a parcel of land, you know, build capacity, bring in allies from the Asian community and the gay community to lend development expertise, and negotiated ownership partnership agreements. That's 5149 in favor of Africa Town. And Enterprise and other investors had to come in and deal with the community agreement that was forged together. It's now 3 years. They have a building with 120 units of housing called Africa Town Plaza. In a quarter of the land that was sold, we negotiated, you know, the tactics helped, because we said, we're going to stop your construction and your zoning application if you don't sell some land to us. So we did use that tactic. But we also answered the call that if we sold you land, you wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. So we said, we do have a coalition to help. And that's when they put on social media, we need Black talents, brilliant beauty and talent. And there were Harvard Architectural School Black architects and Black lawyers coming in from all over the country because there was a focal point, because there was an organization. Those lawyers and those students did not have to give up their career, did not have to take a vow of poverty. They did what they were trained to do. But they found an organization that's centered in community, that became the focal point, the rallying call, and the leadership, where all the talents can come and support. And they came in and did design studios and this and that, all for free. And now Africa Town Plaza is opening. We fought for community preference policy. We fought for community preference policy, where if you can show that you lived here 3 generations ago, you will get preference to come back. Whether you're Black or Jewish, it's not race-based, but it's social fabric-based. So it was like they're so proud now, they didn't need me anymore. I faded in the background, and they're charging forward. And the pivotal point, the inflection point, was King willing to give up the traditional militant fight, because he was going to get arrested. And I told him, I got a deal for you if you will vacate King, and you need to vacate now, right? Because once you bust it, the deal's off the table. And he wouldn't do it, or my father would. And I said, it's not your father's fight, it's your fight. So what happened that evening, he gave me a call, and I said, King, where are you? I was so worried that he's in jail. He said, I'm in the driver's seat of a U-Haul, and we're packing up to vacate. And I said, great. So the next morning, we went back to negotiate a deal with the developer who bought the land, sold them 25%. We will let their zoning application go, handshake, inked the agreement. And you should come visit Seattle, look at the Central District, Midtown Plaza, Africa Town Plaza. They even forced the developer to use the facade to put artists to render all the pioneers from the Black community that have come through the Central District. Ernestine Anderson, the jazz players. It's now the focal point of the Black community, and a few Black businesses actually came back as a result. Now, this is not to say community development solves everything. There was the passion in King, but the tactic was not correct. And so with coalition and leadership, you know, my strategies, the coalition's development wherewithal, their willingness to enter into a partnership 5149 with them, build a united front, so to speak, where the developer had no choice but to yield in order to get his development funded and passed, right? So again, to your question about How do you tell young people to give up? They don't have to give up. They just need to look for opportunities and follow their passion and go where their leadership is needed. Even if it's one time, you know. And then Harvard brought Wai King to the design thing, whatever that, yes, that very prestigious thing, and he told the story and all of that, and more students sign up to do design studios. So the takeaway is that you don't have to sacrifice everything to become a militant to the point where you go to jail, you tell your kids, I'm going to be busted. You can turn the thing around and strategically find another path and still succeed, one step at a time, right?
Okay, I lied. There was only time for one more question. But I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this panel. And can you just join me in giving this panel a big round of applause?